The first time my mother asked to be added to my savings account, my brain automatically classified it as a joke. Not because there was anything funny about it, but because the request was so wildly outside the understood boundaries between a parent and an adult child that humor felt like the only reasonable container for it. I laughed. She didn't laugh back. The silence that followed was the first real clue that something had changed, or perhaps that something had always been there, and I had simply never been positioned to see it clearly. The conversation happened during Sunday dinner, one of those standing family rituals that had existed for so long nobody questioned them anymore. My parents hosted. My sister Rachel brought dessert. My wife Emma and I brought wine. We sat around the same dining table we'd been using since I was 16, talking about nothing in particular, and the evening was entirely ordinary until the moment it wasn't, which, looking back, is an accurate description of how most family ruptures begin. The conversation had drifted toward housing prices, which was not unusual territory for our dinners. Emma and I had been saving for a house for almost 4 years, not because we were incapable of buying sooner, but because we'd made a deliberate choice to wait until we could do it without financial strain. That meant saying no to vacations, new cars, impulse purchases, and weekend trips we couldn't fully justify. We weren't living austerely. We just treated long-term goals as real commitments rather than abstract aspirations, and that discipline had brought us genuinely close to the finish line. When my father asked how the house search was going, I told him honestly that we were getting close. My mother's attention shifted immediately, and I noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure, not alarming yet, but present. She asked how much longer. I gave a vague answer. She pressed slightly. I shrugged. Emma glanced at me across the table, a small look that most people would have missed. I didn't miss it. We'd had versions of this conversation before, not about the account, but about information. Emma had always believed that financial details were private. I'd been more relaxed about that distinction, which had historically not mattered much. Unfortunately, this was not one of those times when it wouldn't. 3 days later, driving home from work with my phone connected to Bluetooth, I answered a call from my mother. The tone was warm in a way that, if I'd been paying closer attention, I would have recognized as a sign. My mother became noticeably sweeter whenever she wanted something, not maliciously, not as a calculated strategy, but as a pattern so deeply embedded that she probably wasn't aware of it herself. She asked what I was doing with my life, which felt immediately strange, and after I made a joke about it, she laughed, and then paused, and then said she'd been thinking about the house. I relaxed. Housing felt harmless. Then she said I should make sure somebody besides Emma could access my accounts in an emergency. And when I said Emma already had access, she said quietly, "Besides Emma." I asked why. She paused for longer than felt natural, and then said, "I think you should add me." I nearly missed a green light. Not because I was shocked exactly, but because I was genuinely working to determine whether I'd heard her correctly and whether the sentence meant what it appeared to mean. The conversation that followed lasted 15 more minutes and consisted mostly of hypothetical emergencies. What if something happened to me? What if the bank needed authorization? What if Emma wasn't reachable? What if I couldn't be contacted? Every scenario was technically plausible, which is precisely what made the argument effective. The best manipulation rarely involves outright lies. It involves possible truths, carefully selected and arranged until the unreasonable begins to feel reasonable through sheer repetition. When I got home, Emma was sitting on the couch with her work laptop. I set my keys down and told her what my mother had asked. She lowered the laptop slowly, looked at me for several seconds, and then asked me to please tell her it was a joke. When I sat beside her and confirmed that it wasn't, she closed the laptop entirely, a gesture I had learned to associate with serious conversations, and said something that stayed with me for months afterward. People who respect boundaries don't ask for access. They ask for help. I asked her what the difference was. She said, "One seeks support. The other seeks permission to cross a line." At the time, the distinction felt subtle. Later, it would become the entire architecture of everything that followed. For a few weeks afterward, nothing happened on the surface. My mother didn't bring up the account again. No follow-up texts, no forwarded articles about financial planning, no concerned voicemails. The silence was almost convincing. The problem was that I knew my mother well enough to understand that she rarely abandoned ideas. She stored them, and then approached them from different directions until she found a route that worked. She was patient in a way that only people who believe they are fundamentally correct can be patient, because they aren't waiting for permission so much as waiting for the right moment. About 3 weeks after the phone call, Rachel invited Emma and me to lunch. My sister and I occupied that comfortable adult sibling territory where conversations revolved mostly around work, family, and whatever minor disaster was currently dominating the group chat. Halfway through the meal, she asked, with what sounded like genuine casualness, how the house fund was looking. Emma's eyes moved to mine immediately. When I asked Rachel why she was asking, she shrugged and said Mom had been wondering. There it was. The account conversation hadn't ended. It had simply relocated. My mother had stopped asking me directly and started gathering information through other people, which was a more sophisticated approach and, in some ways, more troubling than the original request. Emma said almost nothing during that lunch, but in the car on the way home, she sat quietly for a while and then said, "She's not asking because she's curious. She's mapping the situation." The statement landed uncomfortably, not because it seemed dramatic, but because it matched something I'd been trying not to fully articulate. Controlling behavior rarely announces itself with dramatic declarations or obvious aggression. It arrives, most of the time, wearing the face of concern, and that is what makes it so difficult to name without sounding paranoid. A month after that, my father called on a weekday evening. We talked about work, the weather, a baseball game neither of us cared about particularly. Then, as an apparent afterthought, he asked which bank I was using these days. I smiled, not because anything was funny, but because I suddenly knew with complete certainty where the question had originated. When I said, "Dad, Mom asked you to ask me," there was a pause, and then the quiet sigh of a man who has spent a long marriage being the intermediary and is tired of it. "Maybe," he said. We both laughed, and for a moment it almost felt light. But afterward I sat with what the call actually meant. My mother was no longer asking me. She was asking around me, through anyone positioned close enough to be useful. Rachel, Dad, probably others I hadn't identified yet. The account itself had become almost secondary to the fact that she couldn't access the information she felt entitled to, and that gap between what she wanted and what she was getting seemed to be driving something larger. The thing that changed everything came from an accidental conversation. Emma ran into my cousin Lauren. She worked in estate planning, was smart and practical, and tended to accidentally accumulate everyone's family secrets because people overshared around her. The conversation drifted, the way conversations do, toward parents, and then toward boundaries, and then toward my mother. Emma mentioned the savings account request. Lauren nearly choked on her coffee. "She asked you to?" she said. When Emma told me that evening, my stomach dropped, not from surprise, but from recognition. Lauren's story was from years earlier, following her divorce and a financial settlement that had given her stability but made her suddenly visible to people who paid attention to money. Within months, my mother had begun asking questions, offering advice, raising scenarios about emergencies, and eventually suggesting account access. Not ownership, not control, just access, for emergencies, using the exact same language, the exact same justification, the exact same script that she had used with me. Lauren refused. My mother acted hurt for months afterward, and eventually the subject was never raised again. But the pattern had been established, repeated, and now confirmed across time and relationship. Patterns are important because individual incidents can almost always be explained away or reframed as misunderstandings. A single strange request can be chalked up to anxiety or poor communication. Two identical requests, years apart, targeting two different people at moments of financial security. That is something else. That is design, whether conscious or not. And understanding that distinction shifted the entire frame of what I was dealing with. This wasn't maternal anxiety expressed awkwardly. This was a recurring behavior that had existed before me and would likely exist after me. And the question was simply whether I was going to engage with it on the terms it demanded or on terms I chose. The next family dinner felt different because I was watching differently. Once you understand a pattern, you begin noticing the details you previously filed as unremarkable. The questions, the framing, the small attempts to extract information or establish presence. At one point my mother asked where we were keeping the house fund now, and the table got quiet in a way that was notable not because the question was outrageous, but because the repetition had become visible to everyone. Even Rachel, even Dad. Before I could answer, Emma said simply, "Safe." My mother smiled and said she was just asking. Emma smiled back and said, "So are we." Nobody spoke for a few seconds, and something shifted in that silence. My mother realized, perhaps for the first time, that the resistance wasn't just mine. The text messages started a few days later. Articles about emergency planning. Forwarded stories about family members who had helped other family members through financial crises. Examples of parents protecting adult children from mistakes. Each one arrived alone and looked harmless. Together they formed a sustained, low-grade campaign. Not aggressive, just persistent, the way water works on stone. The underlying message was consistent. Access equals trust, and refusal equals doubt. The pressure remained subtle enough that explaining it to someone who hadn't been living inside it would have sounded almost paranoid, because no single message was inappropriate. The problem only appeared when you stood back and looked at the shape of the whole. The confrontation didn't begin with a fight. It began with a phone call from my aunt on a Wednesday afternoon, which in some ways was worse, because arguments are at least honest about what they are. My aunt called with what sounded like genuine concern and asked why I didn't trust my mother. The question hit hard enough that I thought I'd misheard it. She said my mother was really hurt. I asked what exactly my mother had told her, and the hesitation before she answered told me more than the answer itself did. Eventually, she said you won't let her help if there's an emergency. Somewhere between my mother's telling of the story and my aunt's hearing of it, the request for account access had become a son preventing his mother from helping him in an emergency. The language had been rewritten. The meaning had changed. The narrative had been refitted for a wider audience. I spent the rest of that call carefully explaining the actual sequence of events. When we hung up, I sat for a long time staring at nothing in particular. I wasn't angry. I was concerned, in the way you become concerned when you realize a private disagreement has been converted into a public referendum. This wasn't about the account anymore. The account was just the vehicle. The real conflict had gone external, and that changed the nature of what I was dealing with entirely. A week later, Rachel called and skipped the pleasantries. "You know Mom's crying about this, right?" I asked her to explain to me, as specifically as possible, why our mother needed access to my savings account. There was silence. Then, for emergencies, I waited. Still nothing more specific. Eventually, she said, "You know what I mean." And I told her honestly that I didn't, because I genuinely didn't. If I was incapacitated, Emma had access. If something happened to both of us, legal processes existed. If someone needed to reach us, there were phones. Every scenario my mother described had already been addressed. The account access solved a different problem, and it was becoming increasingly impossible to pretend otherwise. The situation reached its breaking point at my father's 68th birthday dinner. It was a small gathering, immediate family, a few relatives, the kind of evening people attend expecting cake and awkward nostalgia, not a family reckoning over financial autonomy. Halfway through dinner, my mother navigated the conversation toward aging, then estate planning, then emergency preparedness, with the practiced ease of someone who has been steering conversations toward specific destinations for decades. She said, "You never know when family will need to step in." Several relatives nodded. Dad looked at his plate. Rachel found her drink suddenly fascinating. And then she said it. "I still don't understand why Nathan doesn't trust me." The room went silent with the specific quality of silence that falls when everyone understands that what they are witnessing is not a conversation but a performance, and that they have been assigned roles in it. My usual role involved discomfort followed by retreat followed by an uneasy peace that required me to quietly accept the premise of whatever had just been argued. I had played that role many times. That night, I was too tired to perform it. I looked at her and asked what trust had to do with account access. She smiled sadly, the victim expression she had spent decades perfecting, and began the emergency scenario again. I interrupted her for the first time that evening and said Emma already had access. She pivoted, "But what if Emma needed help?" I stared at her and asked what kind of help, specifically. No answer. Then I asked the question I'd been carrying for months. "How many other people have you asked?" The room froze. My mother's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but enough. Dad looked down. Rachel looked away. And in the silence that followed, I understood that the answer was more than one and had probably been more than one for a very long time. My mother opened her mouth, closed it, and then said, "That's not relevant." The statement landed like a confession, because innocent people answer questions, they don't redirect them. I nodded slowly and said, "It is to me." Then I said the two words that broke the evening open entirely. "Lauren told us." The surprise on her face lasted only half a second, but it was unmistakable, and it was surprise, not outrage, not confusion. The surprise of someone discovering that information had traveled farther than they'd calculated. And in that half second, every relative at the table understood that what they were watching was not a new argument, but the visible tip of something much older. This wasn't about one son, one account, one request. This was a pattern, a family pattern. And once people start connecting their own observations to a larger shape, it becomes almost impossible to convince them they're wrong. My mother looked around the table searching for support and found none. Then she made the mistake that changed everything irreversibly. She pointed at me and said, "After everything I've done for you." Everyone recognized that sentence. Not the words specifically, the strategy, the debt, the invisible emotional invoice that arrives precisely when an argument isn't going well, because guilt travels faster than logic and hits harder than facts. And suddenly the account wasn't the issue anymore. The issue was whether being someone's parent entitled you to permanent involvement in their life, their decisions, their finances, their future, simply by virtue of having given them one. I stood up slowly. Not in anger. I wasn't angry, or at least anger wasn't the dominant feeling. I was done, which is a different and in some ways more final state. For the first time that evening, I stopped defending the account. Because the account had never been the real argument. The real argument was about control, and everyone at the table had finally begun seeing it. I looked at my father first. He sat quietly with his eyes on the table, exhausted in a way that suggested he had watched versions of this his entire marriage. Perhaps not always about money, perhaps not always about accounts, but about access, about the need to be involved, to know, to remain central. The expression hurt more than anything my mother had said, because it implied a long history I had only ever seen fragments of. Then I looked at my mother and said, "You keep talking about trust, so let's actually talk about it." I walked through the sequence without raising my voice. The original request, Rachel being asked, Dad being asked, relatives being contacted, Lauren years before, all of it laid out in order. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me longest. If I gave you access tomorrow, what exactly would change? The silence was long. When she finally answered, she said she'd know everything was protected. I told her everything was already protected and named the mechanisms: Emma's access, legal protections, emergency contacts, power of attorney processes. All of it already existed. The only thing that would change was that she would have control. And then, for the first time, I said it plainly. This was never about emergencies. You just don't like not having access. She said I was turning her into a villain. I told her honestly that I didn't think she was a villain. I thought she was someone genuinely incapable of accepting that the people she loved were living lives that extended beyond her reach, and that this wasn't cruelty on her part so much as an inability to distinguish between love and ownership. That surprised her. It surprised most of the people in the room. But it was true, and saying it felt important, because villains know they are crossing lines. My mother genuinely believed no line existed. The month after that dinner was sustained and exhausting. Texts, calls, voicemails, emails, messages relayed through relatives. Every available channel. Some angry, some heartbroken, some manipulative, some genuinely sad in ways that were difficult to dismiss. That was the hardest part. Not all of it was performance. I believe my mother was genuinely hurt, genuinely felt rejected, genuinely did not understand. In the way people never understand things they've never had to examine. What she had been doing. Being hurt is real, but it doesn't create entitlement. Being a parent is real, but it doesn't create ownership. And love, whatever its depth, does not require unrestricted access to the people you love. One evening Emma found me in the living room listening to a voicemail. My mother was crying, talking about family, about distance, about how she didn't understand what had happened. When it ended, Emma sat beside me and asked, "What are you waiting for?" I knew exactly what she meant. I was waiting for the right combination of words that would make everything understandable, the breakthrough conversation that would resolve the fundamental disagreement. But the disagreement wasn't informational. My mother understood my position. She rejected it. Those are different things, and no amount of further explanation was going to collapse the distance between them. The next morning, Emma and I went to the bank and updated the account settings, additional authentication, security questions, emergency contacts reviewed and confirmed. Not because my mother had done anything illegal, but because the situation had reached a point where peace required actual distance, not just emotional distance. Afterward, sitting in the parking lot, Emma asked whether I thought my mother would ever accept it. I thought about the question for a long time. Then I said no, not because she couldn't, but because acceptance would have required admitting something she had spent her entire life resisting. That her children were separate adults, building separate lives, and that their separateness was not a rejection of her, but simply the natural outcome of raising people who were capable of standing on their own. Months later, after another wave of contact and another failed attempt at a conversation that would somehow change what couldn't be changed, I blocked her number. The decision felt terrible for a few days, then painful for longer than that, then gradually, in the way that follows hard decisions rather than easy ones, strangely calm. Rachel called crying. Dad called, disappointed and sad. Relatives called with concern that ranged from genuine to performative. I listened to all of it politely and then did nothing, because for the first time I had stopped negotiating my own limits. And eventually the noise faded. Not immediately, not cleanly, but the way storms leave, by degrees, until one day the air is different and you realize you've been breathing more easily for a while without noticing when that started. A year later, Emma and I bought the house. The same house we'd been saving for through 4 years of discipline and deferred pleasures. The same account my mother had spent months trying to access. The day we signed the paperwork, I sat alone in the empty living room for a while before we moved anything in. Sunlight came through the windows. The rooms echoed. The place smelled like fresh paint and the particular kind of possibility that only belongs to the beginning of things. I understood, sitting there, what the savings account had actually represented. Not the money. We'd have found a way to buy the house regardless of what happened with my mother. What it represented was something harder to name and more important. A life built without permission, a future that belonged to us, independence that did not require anyone else's blessing to be real. My mother had spent months arguing that access to that account was an act of love. Maybe she even believed it. But some people confuse access with closeness so completely and for so long that they stop being able to distinguish between the two, and no amount of conversation can restore the distinction for them. Because the confusion is not a mistake. It is how they have learned to love. I never spoke to her again. Not from hatred, not from a desire for revenge or punishment, but because every relationship eventually arrives at the point where protecting your own peace matters more than preserving someone else's access to you. That point arrived for me over a savings account, which is an almost absurdly small thing to be the hinge of something so large. But it was never really about the account. It was about what happened in the moment I said no. And everything that followed told me everything I needed to know.